So, welcome to this video. This is some vintage audio I found on my SoundCloud channel that I had uploaded years ago, had completely forgotten about, and I've been gathering up my archives of vintage stuff I did when I first started my whole YouTube content creator journey. This one is called The Power of Story, which is also the name of my new course, which is coming out. And I hadn't realized that I'd kind of used that phrase, the power of story, over and over again, kind of over time. And so when I found this audio, I thought it was interesting because that was what I picked for my new course, Writing for Fiction and Nonfiction. So this is just a little bit of audio about the power of story, the power of storytelling, how fiction changes our lives, changes our perspectives, and why stories are so important. So enjoy this little bit of audio, and yeah, it's a lot of fun. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the other side. Hello, everyone. My name is Cameron Cowan. This is a different sort of thing I'm doing. For years and years, I used to do stand up, and I've told, and I don't necessarily tell lots and lots of jokes or do ventriloquism or all that type of thing, but I like to tell stories. I live a pretty interesting life, and some things from my life have been pretty crazy and rather interesting, and so I thought it would be fun if I did some storytelling for you all. And that is, I think it'll be fun. I think it'll be fun, and we'll have a good and interesting time. Now, for those of you that watch the talk show, you know that I regularly appear every Monday and Friday talking about news and politics on the Cameron Cowan Show. And I'm happy to report that we will not be doing anything to do with the talk show this evening. I have almost no politics planned, except maybe for some bits about Donald Trump because, well, it's Donald Trump. It's like when a rich man runs for president and decides that he's the greatest thing since sliced white bread and that he can just do everything and be everything and run on absolutely no substance whatsoever. It lends itself to some comedy, I think. However, it's mostly gonna be stories about my life and different things that have gone on and just some crazy moments that I think happen to us all, but I think are rather interesting. As a writer and as an artist, one of the first things I think you learn out of the gate is that when you go someplace or get invited to a dinner party, whatever have you, one of your jobs is to tell a story, be entertaining. That's probably not true for every writer. I'm sure someone, that's very kind of, cool, like Joan Didion or Margaret Atwood, is not obliged to sing for their supper. But I have found in my case that a good story is a good way to get an evening off right and certainly make people feel good about giving you free food. As someone who has had to live frequently at the kindness and courtesy of other people, I think everyone feels better about giving their local favorite broke, starving artist some free something if they've gotten to hear a free story for it. My last regular job before I broke off to write full time, I was working at this women's rehab center in Longmont, Colorado. And right before I worked there, the lady who owned it was getting her business started, and she invited me up to dinner to talk with these women, one of whom was a friend of hers, and the other was a writer, and she wrote for women's magazines and this sort of thing. And so then she invited them to dinner, invited me as well. And so I started telling stories, and I would talk about TV and movies and film and all this sort of thing. And one of the stories that we told, or that I told, was about black people and hair. Now I think at the time about the time that this thing happened, Chris Rock's movie Good Hair had just come out, and there was this the TV show American Horror Story. It was the Coven season, and Angela Bassett has this great line in the movie, and 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 so I'm going along and I'm talking about the TV show, and I'm talking about, good hair, and some of the machinations that people go through in order to have good hair. And I finished the whole story, and which just caused them to absolutely burst out laughing. And I think it's always entertaining when white people burst out laughing at something black folk have done. And so I'm telling the story, and I was going along, and I said, yeah, I said, for a black person, keeping your hair looking good is important, because when your hair is nappy, white people ain't happy. And they burst out laughing. They burst out laughing because they knew I was right. And it's kind of moments from those when I'm telling a story are very interesting, because not only do they make for good moments now talking to you here, but it also makes for excellent excellent moments at that time that I think are always really interesting. So it's moments like that that make me want to tell the story, because I got to tell them about this, great TV show that I would have never heard of or ever watched if I hadn't mentioned it, all this sort of thing, and then I get to finish with a great line. If while your hair is nappy, white people ain't happy. So that's why I like to tell stories. Stories are very compelling. We live stories all the time. Even when we sleep, our mind spends that time telling us stories. Even though we don't necessarily remember them, we're always telling stories. The other day on on Facebook, I saw this post someone had taken from Neil deGrasse Tyson's Twitter account, rather. And he had tweeted and said, why does belief bring us together more than objective truth? And someone had posted this picture on Facebook. And I said, well, the power of story, which is what underlies a shared belief, is more powerful than reality. And I think that's because a story creates a construct. It's something we can get our minds around, and it's something that we can understand. Objective truth is only going to be that compelling when there's a story around it. And if you think about religion and the fact that we have wars about religion, it's rather insane, because you are basically having a war because someone does not agree with your story. Religion is a cosmology that explains the reality around us in a way that people can understand. It's a clever story to explain truth. However, as I said, I find it interesting that when you have religions at odds with each other, you have people fighting over a story, because their whole identity is defined by what story they have decided to believe in. And I think that is so fascinating and so compelling, that the power of story is so potent that we will go to war and set ships to sea if someone does not agree with our story. So I think if Neil deGrasse Tyson wants objective truth and rationality to be as compelling as religion, which is a sophisticated story, then he has to make objective truth fit into a story that people can believe in. And I think that's going to be difficult. That's going to be that's going to be difficult. And the reality is perception is reality, and sometimes people choose not to acknowledge objective reality, because whatever story they've invented to go along with reality is far better and far easier to believe in than maybe the stark relief of reality. Which kind of gets me to another subject that is rather interesting. Uh Racism, in case you haven't noticed, you might have been hiding under a rock, you might have been sitting at home not paying attention, or just generally out of things. You might have noticed that racism seems to be having a moment. One of the reasons I think racism is having a moment is simply because, in terms of a shared cultural story, in a shared cultural story, you have people who are a part of your story and people who are not a part of your story. And I think one of the central tensions in our society, and I said I was not going to talk about politics, but here we are anyway. I guess you can take the podcast out of the podcaster, but not the you can't take the subject out of the host. Um, One of our essential tensions is basically a fight over story and how we're going to live, and what story we're all going to believe in, and how it's all going to work, and who is going to be a part of something and who isn't going to be a part of something. And the central issue of racism is this, that uh that there is a a story that is the dominant cultural narrative, and unless you are Caucasian, maybe Asian, Hispanic, generally speaking, you are not allowed to take part in this cultural story. And I think the reason why we've had the Ferguson protests and all this sort of thing is that fundamentally, at a very real level, the real complaint has been that African Americans have not been able to take part in the dominant cultural story. We have been, as a people, the convenient other who, try as we might, have simply not been allowed to participate in the dominant cultural narrative and the dominant cultural story. Now, there have been some rather entertaining moments that have arisen from the Black Lives Matter movement and all this sort of thing, including white people trying to co-opt it with all lives matter and this sort of thing, and trying to, not make it about anybody or anything in particular or all this sort of thing. And I think it's funny because confronted with an opposing story, the dominant cultural narrative immediately tries to create something to swallow it up so that it doesn't have a chance to cement itself as some kind of story. And that, I think, is rather fascinating, because not only does it create more tension, but it has an interesting effect on the participants, because then the discussion goes from the real issue at hand, or the objective reality, and then suddenly becomes more about whose story is right and whose perception is right, and trying to avoid or navigate around someone's perception of reality. And it's kind of funny because I have someone recently who basically accused me of buying into a certain story without actually trying to figure out if the story is true or not, and trying to alter people's perceptions to serve my own need and desires, to have my story be right. Now, I'm sure you might have seen a graphic on Facebook that talks about 54% of our national budget goes to defense spending. Well, I had shared this on my personal page because I have believed for a long time that we spend way too much money on defense. I mean, when you have a yearly budget of $500 million that just goes to tanks and warplanes and men and machine of war and all this type of thing. Somehow I feel like if the military can't make it work on $500 million, I'm not quite sure, what they can do or how they're going to make it work. And I had just kind of shared it off the cuff as this sort of graphic, and then I got bogged down in this debate with this person. And I said, well, yeah, it's probably not totally accurate. You can't depend on these things to be. That's why I shared it on my personal page because it's more of a belief and than anything that I have, firmly grounded in reality. If I were sharing it on the talk show page or promoting it on the show, I would go out and look to see what the facts were like. And that just devolved into a whole discussion where basically the accusation ended up being, as it is on Facebook, comment, 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 and you're sitting around and you're busily checking your phone and on your laptop because you want to see what they found out and all this type of thing. And basically what the accusation was is that you're wrong because you have this story that you want people to believe, and you're unwilling to deal with the facts, whatever those may be, because that's what you want to promote. And that was their defense, and that was their new story. So I deleted the whole thing because I didn't want that kind of thing running around. And it was less about the it was for me it was less about the story and more about getting people to think about a point. The point being is that we have millions of people in this country who are suffering due to lack of employment. We have children who go to school hungry and who have to try to learn on empty stomachs, which I think we can all agree, hangry is a real thing. And if we don't eat, we're not very pleasant to be around, and we may act out in class and do all kind of sorts of stupid things. I mean, even just like around work, someone is walking along and they just kind of lash out at you. They probably need a sandwich, or they probably need to go to lunch or have something to eat. Get those glucose levels up. But uh, there's all these problems going on, and the graphic was more about discretionary spending than it was about total spending. The appropriation this year was $618 billion, which is roughly 23% of the total budget, which will ring in around $2 trillion. And they presented the facts, and I actually posted the facts to say, hey, here's this misleading graphic and here's something that refutes it. But that wasn't good enough because, again, the central conflict between us was over their story versus mine. And even though their story was ostensibly more grounded in fact than mine was, it was still more about the story. And to be accused of believing a false story just for the sake of believing it and then getting defensive about it because your story doesn't fit with my story, I think is rather uh, disingenuous at some level. I really do. I think it's just kind of not fair, and it's uh, not really mindful of people's perception of reality or why things might be. John Adams said facts are stubborn things. But I think even sometimes facts, depending on who is collecting them, how they've been collected, and what their bias was, can sometimes be difficult things because we make them difficult. And I think the push towards rationality and objectiveness and all this sort of thing, I think the reason why that doesn't work and the reason why people are resistant to that is because it flies in the face of everything we are and everything we do. And because of that, because we are storytellers, we are living a story, we are creating stories, we tell stories. I'm sitting here telling stories about my life, all this sort of thing, that we cannot we cannot leave that behind. And in that way, objectiveness and rationality is never going to be as powerful as a story. That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.